In the autumn of 1989, the small farming town of St. Joseph, Minnesota, seemed untouched by the darker currents of the world beyond. It was a place where neighbors knew each other, doors were rarely locked, and children rode their bikes down gravel roads without fear. For the Wetterling family, life followed the simple rhythms of community, school, and family traditions. 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling was a boy of warmth and kindness, known for his love of sports, his wide smile, and the sort of childhood innocence that comes to define entire communities. That October carried with it the crispness of fall, the sharp air of approaching winter, leaves scattered across fields and driveways, the long shadows of early sunsets. On the evening of Sunday, October 22nd, Jacob spent time with his younger brother, Trevor, and his best friend, Aaron Larson. Like most kids their age, they were eager for something to do, something to make the night feel exciting. The boys convinced Jacob's parents to let them ride their bikes into town. Their destination was the Tom Thumb convenience store, just over a mile away. For children, a mile was an adventure, a stretch of road that gave them a sense of freedom, of being just old enough to explore the world without constant supervision. Their plan was simple: pick out a movie for the evening and grab some candy. By 8:30 p.m., the three set out. The night was cool, the air still. The ride itself was ordinary, filled with the chatter of friends, the sound of bicycle tires crunching on the road. At the Tom Thumb, they browsed the shelves, eventually choosing a video, the comedy The Naked Gun. They picked up a few snacks, the kind of indulgence that marked the perfect weekend evening. To anyone in the store that night, they were just three kids on an errand, laughing, full of energy, eager to get back home to watch their movie. When they left the store, the boys began the familiar ride back. The road stretched through a darkened rural landscape, quiet and unassuming. St. Joseph was not the sort of town where danger lurked in the shadows. Parents had always felt safe letting their children roam, and the boys themselves felt no fear. But somewhere along that route, safety was shattered. A man emerged from the darkness. He wore a mask, black, menacing, the kind of disguise that instantly conveyed threat. In his hand was a revolver. The road, once just a pathway home, became a trap. The man ordered the boys off their bikes and forced them to lie face down on the ground. His voice was sharp, commanding, leaving no room for hesitation. The silence of the countryside only amplified the terror of the moment. There were no passing cars, no nearby witnesses, just three children and a stranger with a gun. He demanded to know their ages, as though weighing a decision. Trevor was just 10. Aaron was 11, like Jacob. The masked man ordered Trevor and Aaron to run, telling them not to look back. Confused, terrified, and desperate to escape, they obeyed, sprinting into the night. Behind them, Jacob was left standing with the man. That was the last time Trevor and Aaron ever saw their friend alive. When Trevor and Aaron finally stopped running, gasping for breath, they realized the full weight of what had just happened. Jacob hadn't followed. He wasn't behind them. He wasn't coming. The two boys ran the rest of the way home, panic driving their footsteps. The Wetterling household was thrown into chaos the moment the boys burst through the door. Jerry and Patty Wetterling listened in disbelief as Trevor and Aaron tried to explain what had happened. A masked man, a gun, Jacob being taken. The unimaginable was suddenly real. In a community where nothing like this had ever happened, the Wetterlings found themselves caught in a nightmare. At 9:15 p.m., Patty made the 911 call that would ignite one of the largest and most haunting missing persons investigations in American history. Her voice carried both urgency and disbelief as she explained that her son had been taken at gunpoint. Within minutes, local deputies were on the scene, followed by state and federal authorities. The gravel road where the boys had been stopped was searched, their bicycles abandoned in the grass, a grim reminder of the night's events. Flashlights cut through the dark fields, voices called Jacob's name, and the once quiet countryside became a staging ground for an emergency search. For the town of St. Joseph, innocence was gone. What began as a carefree bike ride to rent a movie had ended in horror. The night of October 22, 1989, would never be forgotten. Not by the Wetterlings, not by the community, not by the nation. Jacob Wetterling had vanished into the darkness, and the question of what happened to him would torment America for nearly 3 decades. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Jacob Wetterling. The moment the 911 call was placed, the quiet routine of a Sunday night in St. Joseph fractured. Dispatchers relayed the report with the kind of urgency reserved for the unthinkable. A child, abducted at gunpoint, missing on a rural road. Within minutes, the first patrol cars cut across the darkness, sirens silent but lights flashing against barns and trees. The officers who arrived were greeted by chaos. Neighbors spilling onto porches, flashlights sweeping the fields, Jacob's parents standing in disbelief as Trevor and Aaron tried to recount the nightmare that had unfolded. Both boys were trembling, their words tripping over one another as they described the masked man, the revolver, and the order that had sent them running. It was a story almost too terrifying to process. Deputies moved quickly to secure the scene. The boys' bicycles were still there, abandoned in the grass, their small frames illuminated by flashlight beams. The road itself was eerily quiet, a thin gravel stretch bordered by farmland and brush, offering little cover but endless possibilities of where a child could be taken. Officers set up a perimeter, scanning ditches and fields, calling Jacob's name into the night. Word spread quickly. By 10 p.m., dozens of residents had joined in the search, some on foot, others in cars, combing through cornfields and wooded areas. People brought lanterns, dogs, even horses, determined to do something, anything to help. St. Joseph had never experienced a crime like this. The town's collective instinct was to respond as a family, to flood the darkness with light and hope. But as the hours passed, dread began to take root. There was no sign of Jacob, no trace of the man who had taken him. The suspect had vanished as completely as the boy himself. Inside the Wetterling home, investigators interviewed Trevor and Aaron repeatedly, careful to draw out every possible detail. The masked man, they said, had a deep voice. He wore dark clothing, possibly black boots. He seemed calm, deliberate, as though he had rehearsed this moment. He asked their ages, chose Jacob, and sent the others away. It was chilling in its precision. The FBI was quickly called in. By midnight, federal agents were coordinating with local deputies, establishing roadblocks, stopping cars, and questioning anyone moving through the area. Helicopters with infrared search equipment were deployed. Every barn, shed, and abandoned building within miles was inspected. Yet the countryside yielded nothing. For Patty and Jerry Wetterling, the night stretched into an endless vigil. Friends and relatives filled their home, offering comfort, helping to answer phones as calls poured in. Each ring carried the fragile hope that Jacob had been found, but each time the news was the same: no trace. By dawn, the search had grown to hundreds of volunteers. Local media captured images of lines of people walking shoulder to shoulder through fields, their heads bent, scanning for clues. School buses were parked to provide shelter for searchers, and community centers became makeshift headquarters. The town of St. Joseph, population barely more than 2,000, had mobilized like a city. The case was already national news. Broadcasters described a boy snatched off a quiet road in the heartland, an act so brazen and rare that it unsettled parents across the country. The photograph of Jacob, smiling, his hair neatly parted, was broadcast on television screens nationwide. His face became a symbol of every parent's worst fear. But behind the public outpouring of support, investigators faced frustration. The crime scene offered almost nothing: no fingerprints, no tire tracks, no physical evidence to identify the abductor. Leads began pouring in, but most were vague sightings or rumors. Each one had to be chased, stretching resources thin. Authorities released a description of a suspicious vehicle seen in the area: a small, light-colored car, possibly a Ford. Dozens of tips followed, but each avenue seemed to end in disappointment. The Wetterlings clung to hope. They spoke publicly, pleading for Jacob's safe return, their voices steady but laced with anguish. "We just want him home," Patty told reporters. Her words resonated far beyond Minnesota. striking a chord with families everywhere. As days turned into weeks, the search shifted from frantic pursuit to structured investigation. Composite sketches were drawn, suspects questioned, polygraph tests administered. At one point, law enforcement zeroed in on a local man with a history of sexual offenses. The community's suspicion swirled, but nothing definitive tied him to the crime. He would remain a shadow in the investigation, a name that surfaced again and again but never with evidence strong enough to secure an arrest. The panic in St. Joseph never truly subsided. Parents who once let children roam freely now kept them inside. Schools tightened security. Neighbors eyed each other warily. The idea that a predator had struck so boldly in their midst shattered the town's trust in its own safety. Jacob's disappearance was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a community trauma, and soon, a national reckoning. The case underscored something chilling. If this could happen on a quiet road in rural Minnesota, it could happen anywhere. And so the search for Jacob became more than a mission to find one missing boy. It became a struggle against fear itself, a desperate attempt to restore the illusion of safety that had been lost forever on that October night. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation into Jacob Wetterling's disappearance consumed Minnesota law enforcement and the FBI. Thousands of tips were logged, hundreds of suspects questioned, and countless leads followed, but no solid answers emerged. The lack of closure left a void that quickly became unbearable, not just for the Wetterlings, but for the entire nation watching the case unfold. Jacob's image began appearing everywhere. His school photo, showing a smiling boy with neatly parted hair and a striped sweater, was reproduced on flyers, posters, grocery store walls, and television broadcasts. Parents saw his face on their way to buy milk or pick up bread. His name became shorthand for fear, a reminder that a child could vanish in an instant, even in the safest of places. The Wetterlings, refusing to retreat into silence, stepped into the public eye. Patty and Jerry Wetterling became tireless advocates, urging people to stay vigilant, urging the abductor to return their son. Patty, in particular, became a steady, determined voice, her grief reshaped into a mission to protect other children. "We just want Jacob home," she repeated, but her appeals carried something larger, a warning that no community was immune to danger. Lawmakers listened. By 1994, 5 years after Jacob vanished, Congress passed the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act. It was the first federal law requiring states to create registries of offenders convicted of crimes against children or sexually violent offenses. The intent was simple but powerful: to track the movements of those who posed potential threats, to ensure that predators could not slip unnoticed from one town to the next. The law was groundbreaking, the first of its kind in the United States, and it laid the foundation for the sex offender registry systems still in place today. In time, it would influence even stronger legislation, including Megan's Law, which made sex offender information public. But its origin was rooted in one boy's disappearance, one family's loss, and one town's terror. Yet, while Jacob's name reshaped federal law, the case itself remained unsolved. The Wetterlings lived in an agonizing limbo, advocates in public, grieving parents in private. Each anniversary of Jacob's abduction was marked with candlelight vigils, renewed searches, and promises from law enforcement that the case had not gone cold. But as years piled on, the questions remained unanswered. The community of St. Joseph, once characterized by openness and trust, carried scars that never faded. Parents stopped letting children bike alone. Sleepovers and camping trips were cut short by worry. What had once been a place where people left keys in ignitions and children roamed free now lived under a shadow of suspicion. Every unfamiliar car, every strange face, became a source of unease. Jacob's disappearance also ignited a cultural shift. The 1980s and 1990s had already seen high-profile child abduction cases. Adam Walsh in Florida, Etten Patz in New York. But Jacob's case crystallized a national anxiety. Parents across America became more cautious, communities more watchful. Stranger danger, already a growing mantra, became an ingrained part of childhood. Despite this cultural change, the Wetterlings continued to push for progress. Patty Wetterling co-founded the Jacob Wetterling Foundation, dedicated to child safety education, prevention programs, and policy advocacy. She traveled, spoke, and met with other families of missing children, channeling her pain into work that might spare others the same fate. But for all the progress, Jacob's absence remained a gaping wound. Each lead that fizzled left investigators frustrated and the family crushed. Some suspects drew particular focus: men with criminal histories, individuals spotted near the crime scene that night. But without definitive evidence, the case could not be solved. Over time, the search for Jacob began to embody something larger than itself. It became a symbol of unfinished justice, a reminder of the thin line between safety and horror. His parents spoke often of hope, but they also admitted the weight of uncertainty. Living without answers, Patty once said, was its own kind of torture. The Wetterlings were not alone in their suffering. Across the country, other families of missing children looked to them as a source of strength. If Patty and Jerry could keep going, advocating, speaking, refusing to let the world forget, then perhaps there was hope for their own children, too. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Jacob's case remained a fixture in Minnesota news, resurfacing every few years with new appeals or new suspects. But behind the scenes, investigators kept circling back to a troubling name: Danny Heinrich, a local man with a record of suspicious behavior. He had once been questioned, even polygraphed, in connection with Jacob's disappearance, but no charges were brought. For decades, he existed on the periphery of the investigation, a person of interest who could never be firmly tied to the crime. And so the years dragged on. Jacob grew older only in the imaginations of his family, his face digitally aged on posters to show what he might look like as a teenager, then as a young man. Each new image carried both hope and heartbreak. The nation moved forward, but for the Wetterlings, time stood still. What no one knew was that the answers had been close all along. The man responsible for Jacob's abduction and murder was still living quietly in Minnesota, blending into the background of ordinary life. It would take nearly 3 decades before the truth was finally pulled into the light. By 2016, 27 years had passed since Jacob Wetterling disappeared on that rural road in St. Joseph. His case remained one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a symbol of innocence lost, a name etched into law and memory but never into resolution. For nearly 3 decades, investigators had sifted through leads, suspects, and dead ends. Yet one name had surfaced time and again: Danny Heinrich, a local man questioned early in the investigation. Heinrich had been on law enforcement's radar since the beginning, but without physical evidence, they could not make charges stick. He had quietly returned to his life, a shadow lurking in the backdrop of Minnesota. Then technology caught up with him. In 2015, investigators revisited DNA evidence from a 1989 assault on another boy in the area, a case eerily similar in method to Jacob's abduction. This time, the DNA linked directly to Heinrich. It wasn't Jacob's case, not yet, but it gave investigators the leverage they had been waiting for. In 2016, under the weight of mounting pressure, Heinrich struck a deal. He would not face murder charges, but in exchange for a reduced sentence on child pornography offenses, he agreed to finally tell the truth about Jacob Wetterling. After 27 years of silence, the man who had stolen Jacob's life stood in court and confessed. What he revealed was devastating. On that October night in 1989, Heinrich had been driving the rural roads when he spotted the boys riding home from the convenience store. He stopped, masked and armed, and forced them into the ditch. He asked their ages, sending Trevor and Aaron running while keeping Jacob behind. He handcuffed the boy, shoved him into his car, and drove off into the darkness. Heinrich described taking Jacob to a remote location. There, he assaulted him. Hours later, fearing the boy could identify him, Heinrich made a decision that extinguished any possibility of rescue. He retrieved his revolver, told Jacob to turn around, and pulled the trigger. 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling died alone in the night, far from home, in the hands of a predator who showed him no mercy. Heinrich admitted he buried Jacob in a shallow grave on a secluded farm property. Over the years, worried about being discovered, he returned and moved the remains. In 2016, guided by his directions, investigators uncovered what was left. Small, fragile bones, scraps of clothing, the remains of the boy whose face had defined a national tragedy. The discovery broke the Wetterling family. For 27 years, they had balanced hope with despair, never knowing if Jacob might one day walk back through their door. Now the truth was undeniable. Their son had been murdered within hours of being taken, his body hidden while they searched, prayed, and built laws in his name. In court, as Heinrich recounted the crime in chilling detail, the Wetterlings sat in silence, tears streaking their faces. The confession was not justice in the traditional sense. Heinrich would serve time for child pornography, not murder, but it was finally the truth. It was closure, though it came wrapped in horror. The public reaction was one of collective grief. For nearly 3 decades, people had carried Jacob's story with them, marking anniversaries, lighting candles, whispering his name. To hear the brutal reality was almost too much to bear. Yet the truth, however dark, was better than the endless not knowing. In the aftermath, Patty Wetterling spoke with the same courage that had defined her advocacy for years. She mourned her son, but she also reminded the world of what Jacob had given, not in life, but in legacy. Because of him, the United States had built systems to track predators. Because of him, countless children had been spared. His face, his story, had changed how America thought about safety. Jacob's disappearance had robbed one family of their child, but it had also galvanized a nation. The laws born from his name remained a lasting shield, imperfect but vital. And Patty Wetterling, though broken by the truth, vowed to continue her fight for child safety, carrying Jacob's memory into every speech, every campaign, every moment of advocacy. The town of St. Joseph still bears the scar of that night. What was once an anonymous farming community became synonymous with a tragedy that reshaped the country. On anniversaries of his disappearance, people gather at candlelight vigils, remembering the boy who never made it home. His smile remains, frozen in photographs, a reminder of what was lost and what was forced to change. In the end, Jacob Wetterling's story is not just about the crime that took his life, but about the seismic shift it caused in America. A reminder that the unthinkable can happen anywhere. A reminder of the fragility of innocence. And a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, voices like Patty Wetterling's can rise to turn grief into action. October 22nd, 1989, was the night Jacob vanished. September 2016 was when the truth was finally unearthed. Between those two moments lies a generation of fear, reform, and remembrance. Jacob's name will never fade, etched into law, into history, and into the hearts of all who still grieve the boy whose last night began with a bike ride to rent a movie.